The Roman Empire in the late 3rd century AD was a colossus. Its legions stretched from the misty highlands of Caledonia to the scorching sands of Egypt. But for all its size, the empire was brittle. Civil wars, economic strain, and barbarian incursions gnawed at its borders. The Senate in Rome still spoke with pride about the Imperium Romanum, yet in the taverns and marketplaces, quieter voices whispered of disasters, of Roman legions shattered by enemies who should have been no more than provincial nuisances. And in the summer heat of North Africa, a name began to carry with it an almost mythical weight, a general born of the desert who had twice humbled Rome's pride and sent its banners tumbling in the dust. His victories were not flukes, they were the work of a commander whose mind was as unyielding as the Sahara's midday sun and as fluid as its shifting dunes. The man was Sextus Julius Firmus, better remembered not for his Romanized name but for his Numidian blood and his defiance of the world's greatest war machine. To the Romans, he was a traitor, an ambitious provincial governor who dared to raise his own standard against the eagle of Rome. To his own people, he was a hero, a protector who understood both the empire's power and its vulnerabilities. Numidia, his homeland, was no stranger to warriors who unnerved the legions. Centuries earlier, it had given the world Massinissa, the master horseman who once allied with Rome, and Jugurtha, who defied it for years in the Jugurthine War. The Numidian cavalry was legendary, riders who could outpace and outmaneuver the best-trained Roman cohorts, striking with spears and disappearing into the desert before the dust of their charge had even settled. Firmus had grown up in this tradition, the son of a Berber chieftain and a woman from a Romanized merchant family. His childhood straddled two worlds, the tribal codes of honor that bound his father's people and the strict administrative order of the empire. He learned Latin and the art of negotiation from his mother's side, but from his father and his clan elders, he absorbed the desert's lessons, how to move unseen, how to read the wind, how to let thirst sharpen rather than weaken the will. By the time he entered imperial service, Firmus was already a figure of note, tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a voice that could cut through the roar of a cavalry charge. The Roman governors of Africa Proconsularis saw in him a man who understood the tribes well enough to keep them loyal, and Rome rewarded him with rank and responsibility. But Rome's grip on Africa was tightening. New taxes were imposed to feed the endless wars in the north, and imperial officials, many of them corrupt, treated Numidian lands as personal estates. Tensions flared, harvests seized without payment, tribal leaders publicly humiliated, and sacred grazing grounds given over to Roman settlers. Firmus saw the writing on the wall. He had been educated in Roman strategy, and he knew that empires did not crumble all at once. They bled slowly from 1,000 small wounds until a single decisive blow made the whole structure collapse. In whispered councils beneath desert stars, he began to imagine that blow. The spark came when a provincial dispute spiraled into bloodshed. A Roman garrison clashed with Berber tribes over grazing rights, leaving several tribal leaders dead. Firmus, called upon to mediate, found himself accused by the governor of fanning the flames. Whether out of genuine fear of his influence or envy of his popularity, the governor demanded he stand trial in Carthage. Firmus refused. Instead, he rode back into the interior, rallying warriors under a banner not seen in a generation, a Numidian standard bright against the desert sky. He sent word to allied tribes, promising to defend their autonomy and drive the imperial tax collectors back to the coast. To the Romans, this was outright rebellion. The Senate was outraged. Dispatches flew to the emperor. How dare a mere provincial defy the legions? Orders were issued for his capture. But Firmus did not wait for Rome to come to him. He struck first, using speed and surprise as his allies. Small detachments of his cavalry began hitting Roman supply lines, torching grain stores and vanishing into the dunes before the legionaries could respond. Within weeks, trade caravans between Carthage and the inland cities slowed to a crawl. Roman officials found themselves cut off, reliant on fortified towns for survival. And across Africa, the name Firmus became a rallying cry, a symbol that Rome was not invincible, that even the greatest empire could be wounded by a son of the desert. This is where our story begins, with an empire too proud to bow and a general too proud to kneel. The first clash between them was coming, and neither side would emerge unchanged. To understand how Firmus could stand against Rome, not once but twice, you have to understand the world that shaped him. Numidia was not merely a province on the map, it was a land of extremes. The mountains cut against the sky like jagged teeth, the plains shimmered under a merciless sun, and the desert stretched endlessly, swallowing those foolish enough to travel unprepared. Life here demanded more than strength, it demanded adaptability, cunning, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The Numidian warrior tradition was older than Rome itself. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk, their ponies as much a part of the family as brothers or sisters. A Numidian cavalryman could fire a javelin accurately at full gallop, then roll away before the enemy could regroup. This mastery of mobility, honed over centuries, was the backbone of their military identity. Against slower, heavier Roman formations, they were like wind against stone, elusive, relentless, and impossible to pin down. Firmus's father was a tribal chieftain of considerable influence, a man who could call hundreds of riders to his banner at a moment's notice. From him, Firmus inherited the code of Amilu, a warrior's honor that prized loyalty to one's people above all else. His mother, however, brought a different education. Born into a Romanized merchant family, she understood the empire's bureaucracy, its obsession with order, and the subtle politics of survival under imperial rule. This dual heritage gave Firmus an advantage few possessed. He could speak to the tribes as a son of the desert, and to Roman officials as one of their own. It was a skill that served him well in his early years as he acted as mediator between Rome and the Numidian clans. His sharp mind and fearless presence earned him the respect of both sides, though it also planted seeds of suspicion among Roman governors who disliked seeing a provincial wield such influence. In those years, Firmus traveled widely, across the salt flats, into the fertile valleys of Mauritania, even to the bustling harbors of Carthage. Each journey expanded his knowledge of terrain, trade routes, and the strengths and weaknesses of Rome's presence in Africa. He noted where the roads were poorly guarded, where supply chains were most vulnerable, and which Roman commanders were too complacent to expect serious resistance. But for all his political and military awareness, Firmus was also a product of the desert's quiet discipline. Nights spent around the campfire taught him that victory was rarely the work of brute force, it was the reward of patience and timing. The desert did not forgive the rash, it rewarded those who moved when the wind was at their back. Tensions with Rome simmered for years before boiling over. The empire's governors, driven by the need to fill imperial coffers, increased taxes on the provinces. For the tribes, this meant surrendering their grain, their livestock, even their horses, the very lifeblood of their culture. When some resisted, Rome responded with force. A few villages were burned as examples, elders were imprisoned or executed without trial. Firmus found himself in a difficult position. As a respected intermediary, he was called upon to keep the peace, but each new imperial decree pushed him further toward the realization that peace was slipping away. He had seen Rome's arrogance firsthand, and he knew that sooner or later, the desert would have to answer in kind. The breaking point came with a dispute over grazing rights. The fertile pastures near the Shat el-Hadna were sacred to several tribes, their grasslands essential for sustaining herds through the dry season. A Roman garrison seized them without warning, posting soldiers to guard the land as if it were imperial property. When tribal leaders protested, the Romans answered with violence. Blood was spilled. Firmus was furious. He rode out to meet with the governor, offering a compromise that would return the grazing rights while keeping trade open. The governor laughed, mocking him as a provincial upstart who thought himself equal to Rome. That insult was more than personal, it was a public humiliation meant to remind every tribal leader present that Rome considered them subjects, not partners. When Firmus left that meeting, he no longer spoke of compromise. He spoke of resistance. In secret gatherings beneath the desert stars, he began to lay the foundation for a coalition of tribes, one that would strike not just in anger, but with precision and purpose. The desert had forged him, now it would shield him. And as Rome soon discovered, nothing is more dangerous than a man who knows both the empire's roads, and the paths that lead beyond them. Rome did not take Firmus's defiance lightly. Within weeks of his refusal to submit, a detachment of legionaries marched inland from Carthage, their red cloaks snapping in the wind, their shields locked in disciplined ranks. To the Senate, this was a simple matter: punish an arrogant provincial and restore the impression of imperial control. They expected a swift victory. Firmus expected them. His scouts shadowed the Roman column for days, sending back reports on its speed, its formation, and its supply wagons. He knew the legions were formidable in open battle, but Africa's interior was no parade ground. The roads thinned into dusty trails, the sun beat down without mercy, and the water was scarce. Firmus would fight not just with men, but with the land itself. The first strike came at dawn. A Roman supply caravan, lightly guarded and strung out along a narrow track, suddenly found itself flanked on both sides by Numidian horsemen. Spears rained down, the riders wheeled, and before the legion's rear guard could react, the entire convoy was gone, its grain burned, its mules driven off. The message was clear: this was no rebellion to be crushed in a single battle. This was a campaign of attrition. Over the next month, Firmus orchestrated a series of hit-and-run attacks. His cavalry struck from unexpected directions, vanishing into the dunes before the Romans could organize a pursuit. He targeted their water sources, seizing wells and forcing them to march farther under the punishing heat. By the time the legions reached their intended forward base, their soldiers were exhausted, their rations low, and their morale fraying. The decisive engagement came near the rocky outcrops of Mount Orus. The Romans, desperate for a stand-up fight, advanced into a narrow pass, perfect terrain for an ambush. Firmus had positioned his warriors along the high ground, hidden among the crags. As the legions entered the pass, the signal was given. Javelins rained down from above, shields clanged, and chaos erupted. The Numidian cavalry, waiting just beyond the pass, surged forward, striking the Roman flanks. Legionaries tried to form their famous testudo, but the uneven ground broke their cohesion. Dust and shouting filled the air, the desert wind carrying the screams of wounded men. Firmus himself was seen in the thick of the fighting, his presence both symbolic and practical. He cut down a Roman centurion, seizing his ornate helmet and holding it aloft for his warriors to see. In that moment, the tide broke. The Roman line collapsed into a disorganized retreat, their discipline shattered under relentless pressure. By nightfall, the pass belonged to the Numidians. The Romans had been routed, leaving behind their dead, their wounded, and precious supplies. For the first time in living memory, a provincial force had decisively defeated a Roman legion on African soil. The victory electrified the region. Tribes that had been hesitant now pledged themselves to Firmus's cause, sending riders and supplies. In Carthage, the news landed like a thunderclap: Rome's authority in Africa had been bloodied, its prestige tarnished. But for Firmus, this was only the beginning. He knew Rome's pride would not allow such a humiliation to stand. The eagle would return, larger and more dangerous. And when it did, the desert would be ready. Rome's humiliation at Mount Orus could not be ignored. In the marble halls of the Senate, voices rose in anger, demanding retribution. The defeat was not just a local embarrassment, it was a dangerous precedent. If a provincial general could rout a Roman legion twice, what message would that send to the restless provinces of the empire? The emperor himself ordered a renewed campaign, this time with overwhelming force. 2 full legions were dispatched from Italy, joined by auxiliary cavalry from Spain and archers from Crete. They were led by a veteran commander, Gaius Macrinus, whose career had been built on restoring order in troubled provinces. Macrinus swore before the Senate that Firmus would be captured alive and paraded through Rome in chains. The arrival of such a massive force was impossible to hide. Traders and scouts carried word deep into Numidia: Rome was coming again, and this time it was bringing the hammer. But Firmus did not panic. Instead, he began shaping the battlefield before the first legionary even set foot in his territory. He ordered the burning of grazing fields that could feed the Roman horses. Wells along the main roads were poisoned or sealed, forcing the enemy to march longer under the merciless sun. Supply routes were harassed constantly, not enough to provoke a decisive battle, but enough to keep the Romans hungry, thirsty, and anxious. Macrinus, however, was no fool. He slowed his advance, building fortified camps at every stop and sending scouts ahead in wide sweeps. The Roman war machine was adapting to Firmus's tactics, and for a time the campaign became a tense stalemate. Then a stroke of fortune for Firmus, a Roman detachment tasked with securing a remote pass became separated from the main army. Firmus pounced. The Numidian cavalry swarmed them, cutting them off from retreat. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Survivors were sent back with a message: "Tell your commander the desert does not forget." The loss enraged Macrinus, but it also forced his hand. Determined to bring Firmus to open battle, he feigned a retreat, leaving what appeared to be a vulnerable supply column exposed. Firmus, sensing an opportunity, took the bait, but with caution. He divided his forces, sending one wing to shadow the column while he led another toward the Roman main camp. It was here, on the sun-baked plain outside Cirta, that the second great battle was fought. At first, the Romans had the advantage. Their heavy infantry advanced in disciplined formation, pushing back the Numidian skirmishers. Macrinus committed his cavalry to flank the enemy, confident the day would end in Roman victory. But Firmus had anticipated this. Hidden behind a low ridge, he had stationed his elite riders, warriors who had sworn to fight until the last man. As the Roman cavalry charged, the Numidians burst from cover, hurling javelins and wheeling in tight arcs to hit the flanks. At the same moment, Firmus's main force fell back deliberately, luring the Roman infantry deeper into the plain. Then the desert itself joined the fight. A sudden, fierce wind swept across the battlefield, whipping sand into the air. Visibility dropped to a few paces. The disciplined Roman ranks wavered as confusion spread. The Numidians, accustomed to such storms, pressed the attack with renewed ferocity. By nightfall, the field was littered with Roman dead. Macrinus's legions, bloodied and exhausted, broke formation and retreated under cover of darkness. Once again, Firmus had done the impossible. He had defeated Rome's best despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The news spread like wildfire. In the marketplaces of Numidia, poets and storytellers spoke of the Lion of the Desert, the man who twice humbled the mightiest empire on earth. In Rome, the defeat was met with stunned silence. But Firmus knew better than to celebrate too soon. He had bought time, nothing more. Rome's pride was wounded deeper than ever, and a wounded empire was dangerous. The real test, survival, still lay ahead. The plain outside Cirta was silent now. The sand had begun to reclaim the bodies, and the wind carried the scent of iron and smoke away into the night. Firmus had done what few dared to imagine: he had broken Rome's armies twice. But victory in the desert was never without a price. The Numidian tribes celebrated, their campfires blazing across the hills like stars brought down to earth. Songs were sung of the Lion of the Desert, of the man who had outwitted the legions. Yet behind the music and laughter, there was an undercurrent of unease. The elders knew Rome would not rest. An empire that had crushed Carthage, humbled Parthia, and subdued the Germanic tribes would not leave Numidia undefeated. Firmus understood this better than anyone. His warriors had fought bravely, but each victory had cost lives he could not replace. Horses were wounded, supplies dwindled, and some allied tribes had begun to drift homeward, their loyalty tested by the strain of prolonged war. For them, survival came before glory. Worse still, the politics of the desert were shifting. Rival chieftains, envious of Firmus's growing fame, began to wonder whether his leadership served all tribes, or only his own. Rome, sensing the opportunity, sent envoys to these rivals, offering gold, titles, and the promise of Roman protection in exchange for their neutrality. Even within his own ranks, the strain was visible. Warriors who had left their families for months at a time returned to find crops untended, herds diminished, and communities struggling. The desert could forgive many things, but hunger was not one of them. Firmus faced an impossible balance, preparing for Rome's inevitable return while holding together a coalition that was beginning to fray. He tightened discipline, redistributed spoils, and promised that their sacrifices would ensure a free Numidia for generations. But in private, he confided to his closest advisors that the war had already entered a dangerous phase. For Rome, defeat was only a setback. For Numidia, every battle drained resources that could never be replenished. The cost of victory was becoming clear, each triumph brought them closer to the edge. And still the shadow of the empire stretched across the horizon. Scouts reported fresh movements along the coast, Roman ships unloading supplies, columns of soldiers drilling outside fortified camps. The eagle was spreading its wings once more. Firmus stood on a ridge one evening, watching the sun bleed into the dunes. He knew the desert had given him 2 victories, but it would not grant him a third without exacting a terrible price. And somewhere deep down, he felt the first cold touch of fate closing in. Firmus's end did not come in the blaze of a third great battle. It came quietly, as so many falls do, through betrayal and the slow erosion of loyalty. Rome, relentless in its patience, tightened the noose with gold, promises, and politics. One by one, tribes withdrew from his banner. The desert that had once been his shield became a vast emptiness between scattered allies. Accounts differ on the final chapter. Some say he was cornered near the mountains, betrayed by a rival chieftain and handed to the Romans in chains. Others insist he took his own life rather than face the humiliation of a Roman triumph, his body committed to the sands in secret so that no enemy could claim it. Whatever the truth, Firmus vanished from the living world, but not from history. In Rome's records, he was a rebel, crushed by imperial justice. In Numidian memory, he became a symbol, a man who twice proved that even the greatest empire could be made to stumble. His victories were sung in market squares, whispered around campfires, and remembered in the cadence of hooves racing across the open plains. The desert erases footprints quickly, but not all traces are lost. Centuries later, his name would surface again in the writings of chroniclers and the stories of the Berber people, a reminder that Rome's power was not absolute, and that courage can burn brighter than conquest. And so the legacy of the African general who defeated Rome twice endures, not in monuments of stone, but in the windswept dunes, in the memory of a people, and in the enduring truth that even the mightiest eagle must someday bow to the desert.